Good morning, I am WaywornWyrm, and welcome to my channel. A Brave New Galaxy, Chapter 1, New Soul. Dearest Tesney, I have settled in just fine in my new home. So far, all the colonists live in a series of apartment buildings that are grouped into small clusters throughout the city. I'm told this was done to balance out the layout necessities of minimizing how many separate nodes they had to make, with the all too real chance that a catastrophic failure would kill everyone in a single node. The air is breathable outside, but it's thinner than we're used to. So most buildings, especially the ones where the colonists spend most of their time, are airtight and are pressurized to what we're used to. There is talk about slowly lowering the pressure over the next few years down to our new normal, but so far that's just talk. Hey, remember when we were in school and you always made fun of me for studying wired infrastructure? Something about how that archaic way of transmitting data would be left behind in the Milky Way and would never be used out here? Yeah, well, suck it. Due to the thinner atmosphere and weaker magnetic field, solar radiation is a much bigger problem here, and a solar flare knocking out communication satellites is something we have to worry about here a lot more than we ever would on New Earth. So I was brought on to the colonial government to help design a wired infrastructure throughout the 6 cities that have been built, as well as the best way to connect them to each other. Isn't that awesome? In the future, as we develop here on Luna more and more, they're gonna have to follow decisions that were based on the ones that I'm making right here and now. Every night, I look out my window and I see New Earth floating there in the sky, and I imagine how you're doing. I wish you would come with. There was a space open for you until almost the last minute. They had saved a seat. You were going to be my +1. But you decided not to, and here we are. Well, I will write again soon. With love, Linza. Lieutenant Stanislav Ranieri jumped over a log. Or rather, a log and a log, as he continued running. As the chief science officer for the NSSF York, he was the 3rd person to ever set foot on New Mars, and he was spending the most time here. Technically speaking, their mission was to scan the planet, then land a small away party just long enough to ensure the claim of the human government on this planet, and then leave to study the moons of the planet. But once the biodiversity scans came back, even before setting foot on the planet, Stanislav had started lobbying for Commander Peck to drop him and part of his department on the planet for a multi-week long stay. In the end, he was able to keep about half of his department, a team of the ship's security, and a very small base. Now, in the middle of the stay, he was finding himself running at top speed, and he was going to run out of breath soon. The creature he was chasing was about 1 meter to 1.5 meters tall and looked like a cross between a kangaroo and a field mouse, if either of those species had scales like a fish. It was fast and powerful, and it knew the terrain a lot better than Stanislav did. With each step of its large feet, the creature would propel itself forward with a power that no human could hope to match. And shortly, Stanislav stopped trying. As he came to a stop, he looked around, catching his breath. Then he collapsed down onto a stump. He and his men had collected samples from most of the nearby life at this point, but this one rather common species kept evading them. It was endlessly frustrating because there was no telling when this planet would be revisited. And even when it was, he could almost guarantee he wouldn't be a part of that group. New Mars was filled to the brim with life. It had as much biodiversity as New Earth, but whereas New Earth was about 90% covered in water, New Mars was only about 70% covered in water. There was a lot more land, and as such, there were simply more land-based animals on New Mars. Even now, as he sat in this forest, he could hear the sound of animals all around him, the buzz of insects, the slight rustle of small animals that were going about their business, and he could even occasionally hear birds. Okay, so forest implied trees, and insects implied small creatures with a head, thorax, abdomen, and 6 legs that were biosymmetrical, and birds implied its own host of specifications, and of course, none of those implications held out. However, he was currently in a large area covered in large plants that were more similar to trees than to anything else, and they filled a lot of the same roles as trees did on Earth. He wasn't hearing insects, he was hearing small creatures of a similar size that filled the same ecological niches as insects did. And the birds he were hearing were more mammalian than avian, but they still mostly fit the bill. All of that was part of the wonder of this world, though. He was here on this totally alien planet, filled with life that had evolved separately from everything he had ever known, and yet the same niches were filled by organisms that were, by and large, more similar than not. He would write up as much about the life here as he could, and start guessing at how the evolutionary tree of this planet looked. And then he would leave what he had to future xenobiologists, who would come after and most likely correct almost everything he put down. There were sure to be mistakes everywhere in his results, possibly even in his data. Hell, for all he knew, his samples were all of mutants who deviated largely from the general population they came from. Lieutenant Commander Leopold Reddy sat in a chair in Commander Damian Nelson's ready room, about to give the ship's captain the latest in a series of reports in the never-ending series of war games. Commander, the war games went off very well. The Relentless successfully held off both the Apollo and Artemis for 2 hours before being destroyed, and in the process destroyed the Apollo and crippled the Artemis. Had this been a real battle, the Artemis would be dead in space. The crew most likely would have been forced to scuttle the ship and make way to life pods and hope to be rescued. Commander Nelson nodded as he took the readout from his XO and flipped through the relevant screens for a second. Thank you, XO. How was the crew doing? Leopold was pretty sure the commander had a decent idea, as he was captain of the ship and all, which meant that the commander was asking him to see if Leopold had the same read of the situation. Great, another test. The thought flashed unbidden through his mind before he spoke again. They are restless and bored, sir. Our entire navy consists of 2 destroyers and 2 frigates, and all we do is endlessly cycle through every war game such a combination can create. Beyond that, without a large expansion of the navy, there is nowhere to move upward into. Hell, I am a lieutenant commander, and the 5th highest ranking officer in the entire navy. Commander Nelson took a moment before responding. That is very true. However, with our new colony on Luna, and some of the preliminary reports I am reading from the York and the Enterprise, which indicate we may have 1 or 2 more new colonies in the near future, there is no way Naval Command is not going to expand our navy in the near future. And when they do, you will probably be tapped to command either a new destroyer, or you might even end up in command of the Relentless. Leopold's eyebrows shot up at this last remark for a second before settling back down. Really? And how is that, sir? From what I've been hearing, there are designs for a new, larger ship called the Canada-class cruiser. Now, I know there have been rumors for years about this ship class, but apparently they're real. The problem is the main lasers on the ship need the ship to be at or above a certain size to work correctly. And from what I've been hearing, they're stuck about 200 tons shy of the size they need. When that problem is solved, there will be, at minimum, one ship of the class laid down. And even if there's only one, Commodore Darter will be given command of that ship. And I will either be moved to the Dauntless or to a second Canada-class cruiser to command. That will leave the Relentless without a captain, and given your relative rank and time served aboard the Relentless, you will be at the top of the list for her new captain. Dr. Saray Gray was in a bad mood. She was at work, so that pretty much guaranteed she would be in a bad mood. She was a physicist, and in theory, nothing was more exciting than being a physicist who got to explore a new galaxy. Except maybe to be a biologist who found this new galaxy is teeming with life. So she should have loved to go to work every day. However, she made the mistake of being very good at her job. Back on Earth, she had been a fairly well-known and good physicist, but she is one of tens of millions of physicists and one of billions of scientists in general. Here on New Earth, she was one of dozens, and being good at her job with such a small pool meant she was promoted out of her job. She was an administrator. In fact, she was the administrator. So far, the population of New Earth, estimated at just over 500 million, had one main research center. That's not to say every scientist on the planet worked at the center. There are plenty in various small labs and institutes, and even some of the universities. But the National Research Institute, as it was called, did the majority of new research and did a lot of the collecting and dissemination of the smaller labs and institutes' work. And Dr. Gray was the head of the National Research Institute. She spent almost none of her time doing the work that she loved, and almost all of it filing paperwork and dealing with resource allocation. Currently, that meant focusing on a project for the government, where they were trying to figure out how to improve the energy shields that some of the larger ships in the Navy had. The best part of this particular project was it was ultimately a physics problem, so she was able to dedicate a day a week toward working on the issue, and no one complained. That being said, it wasn't a very great physics problem. It was taking an existing technology and figuring out how to make it better. Their goal was how to make the shield stronger and more durable to both lasers and kinetic weapons, or things like micrometeors and other space debris, without having to use much more power. So it boiled down to efficiency and how to get the most out of the shield for the least amount of input. As she was looking through the estimates and projections, there was one that seemed most likely to see a 20% increase in strength, a 50% increase in the ability to essentially shrug off a hit by redirecting it in a less harmful way, and a 20% increase in durability, for a 1/3 increase in power consumption and a 20% increase in electromagnetic visibility. The math seemed more solid than any of the other projections that were trying to promise more for less, and it had a good balance of trade-offs. So she decided she would direct the most resources and manpower to that proposal. Thank you so much for listening to the first part of A Brave New Galaxy. Tune in tomorrow where we continue my reading of The Art of War.